We're going to get started here, and I want to first thank the Paideia program that makes possible all of our wonderful programming. And it's not just events, but also classes. For those of you who are undergraduates who are either in the room or watching us live streaming this on Zoom, I want to encourage you to look at the class list for the fall of Paideia classes. They're really interesting, they're diverse, they're different. And we also have a undergraduate fellowship program that Paideia runs that is worth looking into if you're an undergraduate as well. I also want to thank the Gamma Family Foundation, which makes possible all of our Red and Blue Exchange programming. And what we try to do in Red and Blue Exchange is to bring in interesting, diverse voices and have conversations, genuine conversations that cross ideological lines, political lines, and every other sort of line you could think about, so that we have a conversation and we try to learn from one another. So we thank the Gamma Family Foundation for doing that as well. I am Brian Rosenwald. I'm the director of the Red and Blue Exchange, and I will be hosting this conversation, trying to stay out of the way as much as possible so that we can hear from the Congressman. And if you have questions and you're in the audience, you should have gotten a note card where you can write those down, and they'll get funneled up to me to ask those questions in a little bit. Without further ado, I want to introduce Congressman Ryan Costello, who was served from Chester County, roughly, in Pennsylvania, and has some really interesting ideas about everything from climate change to technology to healthcare, and is going to delve into a lot of different areas of policy and politics over the next hour and a half. Without further ado, Congressman Costello, welcome.
Thank you. Should I move this close so that for the live stream? Very good. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here. And I think for the most part, Brian will orient a lot of my comments around some of the questions that you have, questions that you might have. Incidentally, the more free-flowing this is, I think hopefully the more interesting it will be. And so if I'm in the middle of speaking about a particular subject and you have, oh, you know what, and it's directly germane to that, just pop your hand up, and that might actually enable us to deepen the discussion even a little bit further. My bio, I'll keep it super brief. I was born and raised about 25 miles here in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. Went to public high school, went to Ursinus College, played basketball there, got to play at the Palestra once or twice, went to law school at Villanova, and while I was in law school, I got elected to township supervisor in my hometown, which is for government geeks out there, is a legislative executive type position. And you actually oftentimes will serve in a judicial capacity when you're reviewing land use hearings, and did that for 6 years and really liked the public service component of my professional career. I was simultaneously practicing law at the time. Moved my way up the political ladder in Chester County. At the time, in the early 2000s, the recipe for political advancement in the Philadelphia suburbs, and frankly around the country, was to work your way through the county party structure, from municipal office up into county office. Some folks might then run for state legislature, state senate. I ran for county row office, ultimately running for county commissioner. And I frankly always wanted to serve in Congress. I was one of those kids growing up. And my analysis was largely predicated on how Michael Fitzpatrick, who is the older, now unfortunately deceased brother of Brian Fitzpatrick, who is in Congress, who's co-chair of the Problem Solvers Caucus. I think if he's not the most bipartisan member of Congress from a voting score, he certainly is in spirit. But Mike Fitzpatrick had run for school board, was a lawyer, and then ran for county commissioner, and then ran for Congress. And a unique attribute of running for county office versus running for state house or state senate is when you run for county office or municipal office, it's an odd year. So you can be a municipal official or a county official, and then, jump off the cliff thinking you're going to run and win federal office and lose, but still be an office holder so you can continue to advance up the ladder. It was that calculated of an endeavor by me in terms of what I was doing. But I also enjoyed local and county government. I like the public administrative aspects of that. And I must say, and this may, I hope it yields itself in how I answer some questions tonight. When I got to serve in Congress, that was my first time being a legislator exclusively. I was always had this kind of hybrid legislative, executive, judicial type tapestry to the kinds of decisions I made when I was in local and county office. And so when I became a member of Congress, I oftentimes would divorce myself from the ideological drivers of some of these debates because I thought like, well, let's just figure out what the heck we can pass and do that. And we can say the parts that we didn't like about it or the parts that we didn't get, but like, on to the next one, because there's a million other things that you could do if we function well. And obviously everyone here could probably write a very long essay on their observations on how dysfunctional Congress is. Just to conclude my comments, and then we can get to some of the issues. My good friend Charlie Dent, who was in Congress longer than me, but retired the same time that I did, now runs the Aspen Institute in Washington, D.C., lamented that one of the reasons that he was retiring was that they took the fun out of dysfunction in serving in Congress, which I thought was quite clever. So with that said, I look forward to answering some of these questions, offering observations. And, I will say, if I do offer a critique at times of, who I served with or how I served or frustrations as they may have been, it still was a great honor. The people that serve there are overwhelmingly there for the right reasons. I think that's the ecosystem that Congress now operates in really oftentimes drives members toward division, toward accentuating negativity, towards frankly not getting things done. And so that might be something else we speak to tonight. But I wanted to offer that up because I don't want this to turn into, oh, we had that guy who served in Congress and he came and he was so cynical and negative, and what the heck is his problem? I don't want to come across like that. So with that, I'll turn it back to you.
I can assure you that I have a question for the end to end on a positive note.
Fair enough.
So
Okay.
so we'll get you back to something that maybe gives us hope at the very end. I'm going to start with some questions about Republican politics and the Republican Party and the state of things today, and then we'll get into both the policymaking process and then specific policy areas on this. But the first thing that I like to ask people is, what led you to becoming a Republican? At some point, you registered for the first time, you had a choice, and you chose to become a Republican. Why?
So I think, it's very consistent with, political socialization of American youth over the past, I guess 80 years at this point. My parents were Republicans. I grew up and I grew up with Ronald Reagan as president. Things seemed good. I had a very drama-free childhood. The very simple themes of limited government, strong national defense, economic freedom. When you're 10 years old, 12 years old, that's enough, right? That's enough to fill up your reasons for being a Republican versus a Democrat. And so that was it. And I think, that kind of then logically led me down a path of learning more about what the Republican philosophy is versus the Democratic philosophy. But it was never like Democrats are bad, Republicans are good. It was much more I identified and attached myself to what was happening in the country, and it just logically went from there. I will say, if you look at the Clinton presidency, there were times, because remember in 1992, Bill Clinton was elected president because of Ross Perot. And Ross Perot offered this, not anti-government, but kind of independent check. Remember Pat Buchanan primarying George H.W. in the culture wars and, the pitchfork type shtick, which, by the way, probably feeds right into where we are right now as a party. We could get into that. So I was a Republican, but I was also a Republican that could look at how Clinton triangulated, which is what the term at the time. And so that, even though I remained a Republican, what also my political socialization, I think, was also it was also heavily influenced by what happened in the 1990s and the success of the Democratic Party moving away from what people felt was like a failure of the Dukakis campaign in '92. So,
Yeah, I mean, and we should point out so that everyone understands that when Congressman Costello was growing up, Chester County was rock-ribbed Republican country. For anyone who
yes.
looks now at the Philly suburbs and says, "Oh, it's a bastion of blue on the map," that's true today, but that wasn't true at the time. What do you see as the strengths of the Republican Party, the enduring kind of philosophical strengths?
Boy. Okay, so I think I would divorce myself from this populist, protectionist phenomenon, which is really about 2 or 3 years old, maybe a little bit longer, but it's really crystallized, I think, in the Republican Party from an economic perspective. The strengths of the party, I think, are, again, you can say, well, that's not the Republican Party at the moment. But I think, a more light regulatory touch, a lower, more simplified tax code, a strong national defense, believing, frankly, in American exceptionalism, and being proud that we lead with strength as a country, and that the private sector and that non-governmental agencies are better equipped to address and resolve most of the societal challenges that we have is, I think, to me, still a very compelling philosophy, even if you can point to ways where it's failed in the past or where it wouldn't sufficiently address some of the issues that we now have or that the globe has. Those are what I consider to be the strengths of the party.
Are you concerned, those strengths said, are you concerned about some of the direction of the party and where things are
Oh,
going?
sure. Yeah. And by the way, I am concerned. I think anybody who considers themselves like really identifies with one of the two political parties. And it's okay if you don't, right? I still very much do, which is probably why at times I'm so critical, more critical, frankly, of the GOP than the Democratic Party, just because I've always voted Republican. But I think that we are in a point now where it does happen probably more when you're the party out of power than when you're in the party of power, because when you're the party out of power, in this case, President Biden is the president. Okay, so what are people aren't happy about? All right, we're in a recession, or let me rephrase that. There are some economic challenges we have as a country. All right, so let's go after President Biden, right? Like, what has he done? Let's be against that, right? And so sometimes, when you're the party out of power, just saying that what they're doing is wrong can be a governing philosophy or a political philosophy, and it shouldn't be. It can be a campaign strategy, but it shouldn't be a governing philosophy or a political philosophy. And we are increasingly more and more in an age where the more simplified the message, the more that you can cement that and really brand an image or a perception of someone that you're running against or whom you want to be, where I think it can get really, people can get very easily confused in thinking, oh, well, the Republicans are for Trump and Democrats are for, Biden, or name one or two issues or Democrats are for like spending more on infrastructure, or I can't say that the Deficit Reduction Act reduces the deficit, but like you could say, like, look at one or two of his signature pieces of legislation and say that's what Democrats are for. And so my biggest concern, to answer your question, is that you can point to examples where Republicans will say, we shouldn't be in the business of picking winners and losers. We shouldn't use private companies to get our way on social policy when we're critiquing Democrats for doing precisely that. And then, lo and behold, we do that. We just do it the way we want to do it, right? So when you start doing that, is that a governing philosophy, or is that just a bucket of words that sounds good? So that's what I think the big thing. And then I think also really on the trade point, because both parties are now protectionist, and the anti-China sentiment is, and if you do public polling on this, it pops off the page more than just about any other policy issue out there. And so both parties have it inhabits both parties. And if that continues, Brian, then the way that we conduct trade, what we're going to need to do from a permitting perspective in order to make sure that we have the kinds of minerals and materials that we need in order to produce, and how we trade with other countries, we would have to significantly reorient how the modern economy works if we actually go to the logical conclusion of trying to create an us versus China global trade
Trade war thing?
Yeah, trade war. I was going to paradigm is the word I was looking for.
So this one actually comes from one of my students who grabbed me this afternoon and wanted me to ask you, how do you explain, or why has your home county, as well as the other Philadelphia ring counties, moved so far against your party?
Yeah.
And what maybe would it take to reinvigorate the Republican Party in Montgomery County, Delaware County, Chester County, and those suburbs nationwide that are we see this in Atlanta, we see this in Phoenix, we see this in Charlotte. It's not just a Philly thing. But how does what would reinvigorate the party, or what ideas do they have to adopt, or what do they have to change to do better in the suburbs?
Sure. So I think first things first, you can look back to even the 1990s in let's just call them the more affluent suburbs, which Montgomery County and Chester County certainly would be categorized as such. Even at that time, you started to see a little bit of shedding of the dominance of the party on the national ticket. But you also had in a lot of suburban communities around the country during the early 2000s, Bush did enough to hold on. I think his educational policy, I think I think the term was security moms. There was just enough, I think, at the national level to say, yeah, I don't like some of this social conservative moralizing, this is on the heels of Jerry Falwell, moral majority, 80s into 90s. By the early 2000s, that was not a recipe for success in a general election in suburban communities across the country. It was very critical still for winning primaries, but not general elections. But I think there were enough environmental factors, coupled with, very importantly, a lot of very politically adept elected officials who saw the writing on the wall and said, okay, well, I have to be kind of a little bit different, like a Chris Shays in Connecticut at the time, a Peter King, who I served with in New York. When you are, and by the way, just point of emphasis, somebody who gets elected to office, who then, you kind of see him shift around a little bit, they may not necessarily be cunning in order to remain elected, in as much as they are actually a member of that community. They change right along with that community. They see trends, and you start, new issues present themselves, and how the political parties treat those issues, that can get you even more emboldened to be more of a partisan Republican or partisan Democrat, or less of one, in an instance where you can demonstrate your independence. And I think throughout the early 2000s, up through, let's just call it 2010, which is, I think, a moment in time to reflect upon, where I think you started to see Republicans breaking a little bit away from Bush towards the end of his presidency. 2006 was a horrible year for Republicans. At the same point, though, local communities and county parties, when you're the Democratic Party in Chester County in 2007, 2011, right? Like, you never won anything, right? So you have no fundraising, you have no party activists for county races. So, like, you've never had to put on a jersey and compete competitively, right? It was always just like, well, I'm a Democrat, I'll hand out sample ballots and that's it. Once you start getting wins at the national level and national ticket holders can win your county in a presidential year, in a Senate or a gubernatorial year, that gets people a little more activated and gets them a little bit more focused at winning. And I also think the issue sets started to change. So 2010, I think there was a little bit of a reversion to the mean. Folks were worried about spending. I think, the Affordable Care Act and like really making government more of a centerpiece solution to solving the intractable public policy challenges that we have as a country. I think there was a little bit of a rejection of that, particularly upon center-left independents and center-right Republicans. Remember, center-right Republicans in the suburbs, even then, were more than happy to vote for a moderate Democrat over someone who they may view as like too conservative. And then you get up into Trump at a point in time where, and I know we're going to talk about the abortion issue in a little bit, I can say as far back as 2014, if you were to poll Republican women in Chester County, I'm guessing upwards of 60%. If you were to fill out 10 here's 10 public policy questions on abortion, circle which one you agree. I'll give you 3 options for each one of those. At the end of it, those women would probably qualify as pro-choice versus pro-life. So those issues were not working for Republicans, even though self-identified Republicans were still voting for Republicans, right? And once those issues become a bigger deal, and particularly this past year on the abortion issue, when it becomes like, oh wait, this is actually on the ballot. Every single election, every politician will tell you everything's on the ballot, right? And so I think it's kind of you become immune to candidates saying that to you. But when a Supreme Court decision like that comes out, you can actually legitimately feel as a voter like, oh, it actually is on the ballot. What about my daughter? What about my cousin? Whatever the kid. What about me if you're a woman? So I think the issue sets started running a little bit away from Republicans. I think some of the cultural grievances that Republicans will point to, not all some Republicans in the suburbs don't identify with. I think there might still be a little bit reversion yet to come. So to your point, how do Republicans win back the suburbs? I think let's just see how far left the Democrats actually go here. I think the Democrats have gone a little bit further left than some people realize, but it takes a while for those things to kind of cement. Most people aren't paying attention. And so sometimes it takes a few more years than us who pay really close attention to this for that to play out and for you to be able to compete for some of those voters again.
Let me ask a follow-up, because you mentioned abortion, and I've heard in recent days everyone from Nancy Mace, who's a representative from Charleston and is a Republican, to Kellyanne Conway last night was on Fox News saying that with young voters, Republicans had a lot of work to do on abortion, guns, and climate. And so my kind of follow-up to what you were saying is, can Republicans start to make inroads with the suburban communities, with young voters, without doing something to moderate on abortion and guns?
I think that the word moderate.
That might not have been the right
Yeah,
word.
fair. So, but let me take your question as I feel that you intended it, which is, do Republicans need to approach those issues differently and offer solutions that they have yet to coalesce around? I think the answer to that question is yes. Let's take each of the 3. On climate, reducing carbon emissions is something that 80% plus of Americans would agree is needed in order to deal with environmental issues and public health issues. How you speak about that issue and what your policy solutions are well within the ability of Republicans to talk about, whether that's smaller, more advanced nuclear reactors, carbon capture as a means of enabling natural gas to replace coal but still be part of base load. Wind and solar are out there, they function, but they only supply so much of power. Then you also have like advanced building materials, which means you don't need to use as much electricity for things. And some of the policies that can be enacted and have been enacted in order to address a smart way of living through better technology, better living standards, whole bunch of issues. And frankly, Republicans have supported those things. Some either don't know it or don't know how to speak to that issue. And there are ways to do that that are much more private sector driven than what some Democrats wanted to do a little while ago, which was to create like an electricity standard, which by the way could be totally manipulated. So like, again, there's a government solution, there's a private sector solution. I don't mean to oversimplify it, but like Republicans could speak to how climate could be addressed in a meaningful way through their own issue sets that are consistent with the governing philosophy. On the issue of abortion, public polling now will tell you what I could have shared with you a couple years ago, which is this nation and what they categorize as pro-life and pro-choice, those terms are not neatly applied, which is to say, there are those who feel that a woman should have a right to choose up until 23 weeks, 24 weeks. I'm not here to argue over, few weeks versus, my point is like, there are women who feel that you should have that. There are men and women who feel that a woman should have the right up until a certain number of weeks, and they view themselves as pro-life. There are some in the pro-life community who will be like, no, that means you're pro-choice. There are some in the pro-choice community who will say, no, it's up until the there's no limit on it, and if you put a limit on it, then you're pro-life. So what the heck does that mean? It means everybody is confused by what term it is, and everybody uses whatever term they want to use for their own self, and if you disagree with them, then it's likely that you're in the category that they don't associate with. And so I think over the next 4 years, I don't know that it resolves itself this presidential election, but our entire society those terms are going to get a little bit more substance to their meanings, because up until now, they've really just been labels, and both parties have conveniently used those labels for their own candidates versus the other party's candidates. And that's really the best I could offer you on that. I kind of think I know how it shakes out. I think that states will invariably end up with what looks very similar to the way that this country operated since the early 1970s, if not before. And outside of a few states, that will be the way things work. Where I think at the federal level, where the battles will be is in the funding issues around it. Because what I think you'll see is very, very conservative Republicans will seek to limit federal funding on a whole host of healthcare issues if states don't have certain restrictions in place. On the issue of guns, okay, so out of the three of them, I actually think that guns is an issue where this country is undergoing a change, and I don't know what the net result will be, and I'll get into that in a moment. So my son, who's 9 years old, and I mean, even when I was in Congress in 2015, I used to say this to people, but now it's a real life example. Like we are now looking at folks that are in their 30s that did active shooter drills in the first grade. I didn't do active shooter drill. I'm 46. I didn't do active shooter drills when I was in elementary school or up through high school. But it wasn't long after I got to high school when that started. Just imagine being 8 years old, 7 years old in first grade, and your teacher says, okay, boys and girls, we're going to pretend that someone's going to come into the school today with a shotgun and try and shoot a bunch of people. And so we need to plan for if that happens. Like, that is shocking to the psyche of a child. Now, for those who have lived in extremely dangerous environments as a child and they hear gunshots, right? Or they, God forbid, they've seen a brother or a cousin shot. You are those. That's a different dynamic. What I'm speaking to is the number. Like, this is universal, right? That feeling becomes universal. And so kids will ask questions. And then the more that we see shootings, I think the more young children develop a sense of what is or isn't right, or what should or shouldn't be done. And they don't know anything about the Constitution. They don't know anything about who passes laws or what's unconstitutional. They just know that people shouldn't be allowed to go around shooting people in schools. And it evolves from there. I think just this weekend, it was a school shooting at Christiana Mall. And we can go on and on and on. And the media, certainly will point to shootings, and it immediately gets into the question of, like, okay, well, what can we do to stop it? So that, to me, it will be a long-term cultural shift that policymakers are now starting to deal with, because if you look at how people feel about what should be done, there's a lot more younger voters that feel something needs to be done. Legislation needs to be passed to address this. The trick, I think, and if you were to layer on top of that some of the cultural issues, obviously, in more rural communities where, like, your gun in your home is your law enforcement solution, because there is no police officer within 20 minutes of you. So, rural versus urban versus suburban gets layered over top of that. So it's not just, young kids versus old people on what should happen regarding Second Amendment issues or gun safety issues. But it is much more prevalent. And so then you get into the question of, like, okay, so what are we supposed to do? You can do universal background checks. I supported that. Some states have that. Pennsylvania already does have that, incidentally. Will that solve all of the horrific tragedies that we see? It won't. Will getting rid of certain types of weapons do that? I think the answer is no. Unfortunately, it won't. And so what do you do? Like, what could we actually pass to stop this from happening? I don't think that there isn't one law that you could pass in order to stop it. And most of the tragedies that you see, many of the proposed solutions wouldn't have prevented that. Now, I'm not saying nothing should be done. I'm simply saying that there are other issues that I think permeate our society, which also contribute to people feeling that their solution is to be a mass murderer. And I think that that's a real problem. Now, kind of getting away from your question, for the Republican Party, I think that the answer to the question cannot be, well, we can't do anything. The Second Amendment says what it says, and what you're proposing is unconstitutional, and people should have a right to concealed carry wherever they want to go. They should be able to own as many weapons as they want with as many magazine clips as they want. They should not have to undergo a background check. They should be able to go across state lines. It doesn't matter if the other state doesn't allow this weapon, or I wouldn't qualify to own a gun in that state, because reciprocity is what it means, and therefore we should have full reciprocity. I think that the Republican response is not, number one, doesn't adequately reflect what should be done in order to reduce the likelihood or the availability of guns. And number two, I don't think that the American public, to your point, which is a political question, and particularly the youth vote, I don't think that answering the question and saying, well, it has nothing to do with guns, it has to do with video games, it has to do with social media, it has to do with whatever, like that's not an answer either. Sorry,
So
that was a long answer.
building off of the idea of younger voters and things, most of the polling, most of the exit polls from the last couple of elections have shown that young voters lean overwhelmingly Democratic. And I think a lot of the survey data we have shows that they lean pretty liberal. What is a version of conservatism that you think could appeal to those Americans in their late teens, 20s, even into the 30s?
So I think first, laying out the case on how you're going to create and maintain a workforce and an educational system that is going to prepare kids for the changes that are going to take place during their lifetime. We mentioned a little bit ago about what happens if we do enter into a real trade war with China beyond what it already is. Like what's the policymaker response to making sure that we have made sure that we have an educational system and a job training and retraining and certification system so that people can work and put their skills to work. I think that's a big piece of it. I don't have a good answer on some of the cultural issues. And this, my bias is just going to show here, but I'm going to admit that I have a bias. I just think that the Democratic Party has veered so far left on some of the cultural issues, and that it's not even really a safe place if you're a young person to say, I don't agree with that, or that's wrong. You're kind of inculcated to just go along with it or keep your mouth shut. This is what I think. People can disagree with me, but it's what I think. I think that there's going to be a rejection of that over the next 10 years. And I think that some of these kind of litmus tests that progressives throw on people, on companies, in the media, and frankly, amongst young voters who go to college or who are in the workforce, I think that there's going to be a backlash to that, or if not a backlash, the pendulum will swing a little bit in the wrong direction. And the challenge for Republicans is to say that you object to something without coming across as being discriminatory or not accepting of people who have different opinions or who live different lifestyles than you. And that's always where Republicans screw up on culture wars. It's like every single time. But I think that the Democrat, the other opportunity that I think comes about is in the area of technology and how we use technology. I think that there are some ethics that are going to come about. And it's not that the Democrats are going to be unethical with it, but I think that there are some really thorny questions about what we can use data for. That might be more in the regulatory space, but I still think that Republicans and Democrats are going to have to weigh in on content moderation issues and when can AI be used and what data that when you walk down the street and if there's like some camera on the side of that bookstore that scans your iris, like, can that be used for some other purpose? Can it? Like, can it be used to prove that you committed a criminal act a year ago in another state? Can it be used a year from now to help determine some eye or ophthalmologic cure? I mean, the point is it can be used for good and it can be used for bad. This is where, this generation, younger generations are going to be just grappling with things that we never thought about, or if we did think about it, it was because we watched like sci-fi movies. And there's always opportunities for political parties. Remember, political parties are there to organize constituencies and build coalitions. And so if a new coalition is forming or has formed, one of the two political parties is going to determine that it is in their interest to make that coalition or that set of principles or set of ideas part of their own. And so the final one is if you decide you're not going to college or in the building trades, you're going to build bridges, build roads, be a mechanic on an airplane, whatever it is, whatever doesn't require a college degree but requires a degree of sophistication, and part of that, pushes you into the building trades and you become a union member, and you're doing projects in this country, construction projects. Chances are that the building trades or part of the labor movement and environmentalists are not going to see eye to eye. And right now, the biggest clash or collision in the Democratic Party is between the labor movement, the construction industry, those that build things, and the environmental movement, which, again, my bias is going to show, finds ways to say no to just about everything that is proposed. So, like, Republicans have a real opportunity to take the building trades and the labor movement and make it theirs. And Trump did that in 2016. He did it by saying that Hillary was for NAFTA, and in Eastern Ohio and in Michigan, like, that was a clarion call. And that was what tipped the election in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin. He won over that issue. And he built that over the following 4 years, so much so, and I have a theory in 2024 on this, so much so that, like, Biden did not win back some of the voters that people thought that frankly, he built an entire political career on, like, representing, like Joe Sixpack, everybody knows that. Like, he was like working class Joe. And they stuck with Trump in large measure in 2020. In 2024, because of some of the policies that Biden has enacted in the first couple of years of his presidency, that may be enough to get a lot of those voters back, because it was really, a lot of those big bills were heavily curated to bring back, the manufacturers and the auto workers and the building trades back to the Democratic Party. And so that remains to be seen, but those voters are up for grabs, and those voters tend to know that they're going to be working in those professions when they're 14, 15, 16, 17, because they're going to trade schools. I mean, our high schools are now, at least in Pennsylvania, are organized in a way that, like, if you want to get into, like, really sophisticated, even robotics, even more sophisticated construction work or working with your hands, there's usually a county-based high school that you then go to, and you learn those skills while you're in high school, and that you can actually get certified and get in the workforce, make $50,000 a year, maybe more, when you're 19 years old. That's a different voter than existed 40 or 50 years ago. So there's opportunities there too, I think.
I want to focus from here on probably on policy and different policy areas. But I think to start talking about policy, I have to ask you, what are the biggest problems or challenges that you see facing the country right now?
This is the Republican in me. Like, we have a real structural imbalance to our budget. We're spending, real round numbers, about $4 trillion a year. Our revenue is about $3 trillion. Medicare, I believe, goes insolvent in 2030, and they'll find a way to still fund it. But you can't just continue. I think our debt is now 31 trillion. When Trump took office, I don't know, I'm guessing maybe it was 12 or 14 trillion. We spent more. When I was in office, we spent more than came in. So, like, I'm not saying elect me to more things, I'll solve these problems. I mean, it is a structural issue that we have. We spend more than we bring in. That's by far and away our biggest. And just to illustrate that, when interest rates are at like 1%, that's like 14% of our budget goes to debt payments. When interest rates are what they are now, number one, it's more than our defense spending on an annual basis, and it's now, I believe it's 20 or 21% of all federal outlays are payments on the debt, that is a very dangerous trajectory, and that will crowd out our ability to spend on other things or borrow money for other things. That to me, that is our biggest challenge as a country. Number two, I would say, I think China, they just look at their challenges over a longer horizon than we do. And I say this a little bit tongue in cheek, mindful that we're being recorded, but they don't have, they don't have some problems because they're a communist country, right? They can just, the state will just produce more. The state will goose their economic growth numbers. The state will have you build an apartment complex to have people work, and then if nobody lives there, that's fine. Then they'll pay people to knock it down in a couple of years. It's kind of wild. They will invite you into their country as an entrepreneur, but then your IP, they will find a way to get it. We don't do those things in this country. In the AI, in the artificial intelligence space, part of the reason that I think the U.S. has been uh, part of the reason that we are the world's innovators is because of our educational system and because of patent protection. What you build here, what you create here, it will be protected. It is to your economic incentive to do so. But we also do apply some guardrails to what you can do with it. I think the world is now so advanced, though, that and Elon Musk will say, when I first read this a while ago, I thought it was a total joke, and by a while ago I meant 6 years ago. He thought one of the biggest threats was war robots. I'm thinking that's kind of whatever. But if you think about it, if you can fight a war with just machines, and that is kind of scary. And China, I think, unrelated to drones, but a ground war, because our military is based on winning wars certain ways. If that is negated by how another country reacts, and you don't need an army in order to win on the ground, or Marines to win in the water or in the air, whatever the case may be. It's just a whole different dynamic, and the power structures can change depending upon the capacity of a country to use their technology and their innovation in certain ways. And we like to think that we do it the right way and we're not immoral. But and let's just assuming arguendo that is correct. Well, if another country has similarly capable technical expertise, and they act immorally, they could very well end up with an advantage over you. And that just creates an entirely different dynamic, not just us versus them, but their ability to threaten third world countries around them. Right now, I believe there's over 100 ships. And by the way, this isn't an anti-China bash session by me, but right now, I think there's 100 ships surrounding Taiwan, as an exercise, right? As an exercise. What Russia is doing in the Ukraine right now. If we sit back, and this is the new kind of Republican mantra right now, which I disagree with, which Mitt Romney disagrees with, which Mitch McConnell disagrees with many Republican members in the House disagree with, but not all of them, right? Oh no, it's not our war. We have our own problems at home. Well, let me tell you something. People used to say that stuff in the 1930s and the early 1940s, and look what happened, right? We are the world's superpower for a reason. That doesn't mean we enter into long wars, and I understand that people felt that the George W. Bush administration ushered in a war that was unnecessary, and it cost American lives, and it created some geopolitical challenges for us. I understand that, but that doesn't mean that you turn a blind eye when aggression is happening around this globe. And that's a challenge, I think, for our country, because we are now entering a period of time with Ukraine and potentially with China and Taiwan, and there's other examples too, where if other aggressor countries decide that they're going to take more, are we just going to continue to sit back? Because that will change the geopolitical dynamics in ways that I don't think that we've fully explored. Those to me are the two really big, more existential questions about our challenges as a country. There's some domestic ones, but not on the scale of those two, I think.
Let me take you back to the deficit and the debt where you started this. obviously the big crisis of the summer seems like it's going to be on the debt ceiling. And I'm wondering if you think, is there a compromise deal? Is there a way to address the debt that maybe makes no one happy, but at least can get buy-in from everyone? Or are we just so polarized that there's not a pathway here?
Yeah. Well, there'll be a deal on the debt. But what the contours of that deal are right now are anyone's guess, because the parties are not engaging in a way that would suggest that there's a deal sheet and people are now talking about their negotiables and their non-negotiables. We're at a point now where Biden is saying, I'm not going to negotiate, and House Republicans are saying, we're not going to negotiate until you are willing to cut spending. Where I think it ends up is, number one, it's going to happen a lot later in the year than people realize, and so that when you say, well, we're going to run out of money, in mid-July, so we need to do this now. I think it's going to be like, okay, I think you can, Republicans are going to say that's not true. You're bluffing. And then I think that I don't think Democrats are going to go along with any spending cuts, which means then Republicans will say, okay, well, how about permitting reform? How about doing things that will unleash American innovation and America's resources? And then they'd be able to show that will lead to more growth. And so instead of and this is always our problem, we never cut anything. We just pass policies that project that it will grow more, right? So that we will reduce the deficit, not by spending less, but by enacting policies that will create more revenue. So therefore the deficit or the delta on it is less than it was before we passed the policy. Now, doesn't always work out that way, but CBO will score it in a way, and everyone will message it in a way as though that we just did a solution, even though the spending continues to go up. So I think there will be a deal. No one will like the deal, but what will first have to happen is you're going to have to find 60 votes in the Senate. This is going to be a Senate-driven process, and then I won't use the term, but Republicans will just have to eat the sandwich that's sent to them, is generally how. And there'll be back channels. Republican leadership will figure out how many votes they bring. This will have to be a bipartisan bill, because I can tell you right now, there'll be 50 Republicans that will not vote for this, and it might be higher than 50. So you're going to have to get over half the Democrats to vote for this, along with half the Republicans.
I think it's inevitable, fair to say that if we're actually going to do something with the debt, that the way you mentioned it and what it's crowding out, there's probably going to have to be something on entitlements to keep them solvent. But I'm curious that if you go back not too far in history to George Herbert Walker Bush and even to John Boehner, 12, 13 years ago, they were willing to talk about increasing revenues. They may not have liked it. They may not have really wanted to raise taxes, but understanding that dealing with the deficit was going to require a balanced approach. Today, it seems like there's a line in the sand that Republicans have drawn, especially House Republicans, saying, you have to cut spending, but we're not raising revenue at all. Is that tenable, or can we not deal with the debt without some sort of movement from the GOP on taxes, or at least more flexibility?
Yeah, I'm reminded of that presidential debate where it was asked, would you, you may remember this better than I, but it was in 2012, maybe it was 2016, I think it was 2012 though. Would you be willing to raise $1 of new taxes if you got $20 in cuts? And I was watching television, I'm like, hell yeah, why wouldn't you do that? And no one would raise their hand. And I thought, this is not gonna end well for us if we're gonna be this dogmatic. To answer your question, I think that you will see, okay, right now it's us versus them. That's how Democrats and Republicans view one another. So there's no interest in compromising. If you were to do a grand compromise and people actually were willing to say, you know what, I'm going to do this. If I lose, I lose, but let's do something big. Then it would require Republicans to say, yes, we're going to increase revenues. And it would require Democrats to say, okay, we're going to raise retirement age, or we're going to do work requirements, any number of different things that once set in stone will um, kind of freeze the ability to have increased spending on autopilot. The problem with the entitlement it's a problem. The problem and the challenge of entitlement programs is they're on autopilot. So like when someone becomes eligible for a benefit, it's not a bad thing he becomes eligible for a benefit. But once you're in, then it keeps going up, and you don't have the ability necessarily to budget for that. It just kind of happens. And so if you can create delineations where like income thresholds is a good example. So I'll give you a good deal right now. Okay, so what are we capped at? About 120 after about $120,000, you no longer pay. Is it 2.8 on the Social Security tax? It's 2.8, 3.4, whatever it is. The flip side is I know people, they've worked their whole lives. Their net worth is over $10 million. They have a pension. They're going to get Social Security. Okay, do they need Social Security in order to live a healthy, stable life for the rest of their life? No. Have they earned it? Yes. If you were to eliminate that from a certain cohort, if you were to put an income threshold on it, you would save a lot of money there. So you could increase revenue by increasing the income thresholds. You could reduce cost by disqualifying some people who have earned into it. I mean, if you want to piss everybody off, there's a solution. It actually would be a solution, but it piss everybody off. You want to be elected? You want to lose an election? There's a good idea for you. So those are the sort of like very serious, not that I'm, some savant, but like that's kind of like the serious minded approach to policy making that would solve a problem. The political implications and the downfall of that are very obvious, but like it's not rocket science. You have to cut things that people are either entitled to or eligible for or feel they should be. And then you also have to raise revenue on people who already feel they're already paying too much in taxes. So like, you don't make friends in any of this stuff, but if you want to make the system solvent and you want to reduce the debt, which and if you're thinking long term, obviously it's that's the most critical issue.
It's funny. I'm pretty sanguine about finding a solution for Social Security because every one of those solutions you mentioned probably has to be in there. No one's going to like any of them.
Right.
And it is something where I think that the one thing you didn't mention is the mechanism. They'll find some commission to do this so that the politicians' hands are a little bit less dirty on these kinds of things. But I want to ask a couple more questions, and if there's any questions out in the audience with the cards, I will take those and start working them in. I think the solution, because of some of the stuff you just said on Social Security, is maybe easier. But Medicare and healthcare system, I venture to guess that probably 95% of Americans have issues with the system, whether it's their insurance, whether it is their the healthcare system in general and getting appointments, access, all of that kind of stuff. People aren't happy about the system. Democrats have tried to deal with prescription drugs, but as I was reminded recently, 2021 Americans spent $378 billion on prescription drugs, 1.32 trillion on hospital expenditures, and 864 billion on physician and clinical services. So basically, drugs are a small slice of this. Republicans have not really been able to put together a plan. When they were trying to repeal and replace Obamacare, they couldn't really come up with a plan. So what do we do with bringing healthcare costs down, making the system more user-friendly? How do we address this?
Sure. So, there is no silver bullet solution here. I think, and I think you properly kind of put it into two categories, right? There's the cost of things, and then there's the consumer experience or the patient experience. And I get more frustrated by the consumer experience than I do the expense, because part of the part of the medical practitioners will say things cost more because of the stupid regulations you throw on us. Probably some truth to that. Probably not all entirely true, but there is some truth to that. Who was I? Where was I? I was at a podiatrist complaining to me the other day on how much time he spends at his computer at night, inputting codes, right? Drives him crazy. And I used to hear this from surgeons all the time when I was in Congress. Now there's reasons for that, right? But we've demonstrably over time changed the practice of medicine to being 25% a computer job, 25% an administrative job, and at best 50% actually doing surgeries or doing actual healthcare with the patient. I do think that, I'm going to bounce around a little bit here, but COVID created an ironic opportunity for folks and for patients and medical practitioners to learn that you don't always have to go into a doctor's office to get medical care or be diagnosed. And so there are some positives and there are some efficiencies that I think will continue to yield themselves for a better consumer experience as well as lower cost care. The insurance system is, deeply annoying for so many reasons, and yet it is the reason why we have a healthcare system that, believe it or not, is still the envy of the world. And folks can say, well, it's so much better in Finland or Switzerland, and I'm like, whatever. Is it really? Is it really? Look at the demographics of some of these countries where they say that they have a better healthcare system. We have poverty rates. We deal with some of the globe's most vexing diseases, and try and find solutions for them through private innovation much more successfully than any other country. We don't ignore our elderly the way some other countries do. And our health, what is deemed to be healthcare is much more than healthcare. It's, health and wellness in this country, and our housing stock for seniors. So I think, I never felt that we should be talking about, trying to create something that's perfect because it will never be perfect. I worry more, Brian, about, and this is why I didn't, when it happened, I'm like, Obamacare doesn't, I don't think that sounds, and I call it the Affordable Care Act that just came out, but like that doesn't sound, a government solution doesn't sound like the right result. Now that it has been implemented, and I voted against, when I was in Congress, I voted against the Republican replacement plan on the floor because I felt that it didn't adequately address some of the things the Affordable Care Act actually did address that weren't part of the system at the time. And I also worried about kind of the shock of altering the structures in our healthcare system. And so I think that anything that can and should be done to our healthcare system should be done on an incremental basis. And you should say, okay, how can we tweak this and how can we tweak this? How can we make little things better? And if you do enough of those things, and if you're focused on it in that way, you actually can dramatically improve the experience for a lot of consumers, and you can drive down costs for a lot of patients, not all patients. But you still have to remember, like, it is still the insurance companies that anchor the healthcare system, right? That's how everybody gets healthcare in our country, especially now with the Affordable Care Act, where those who are uninsured get healthcare because of the insurance networks that we have. It's kind of inverting everything. But as a result of that, some of the things that you're like, oh man, that's stupid, or oh, why do we have to pay for that? Like, it's because you're not just paying for your healthcare, you're paying for others. And the employer healthcare system is really the backbone of our healthcare network.
I start taking questions from the audience, but while I wait for the cards to get up here, can you delve into what are the things you think that we are not doing, government is not doing, that should be doing in the kind of tech, AI, even digital infrastructure area? Are there things that we should be doing that you think are kind of either warning lights or things where we're falling behind that we're not doing?
Um, I'll take it let's go up a little bit higher than that. I think space is an interesting area because I think there are some other, those in this country that do space policy will say we literally didn't have a space program for like 30 years. And that some of our foreign adversaries have done quite a bit more in terms of space exploration and infrastructure than we have. From a technological perspective, though, so back to tech policy, um, I don't know what the answer is, and I think it's more societal and parenting and our educational institutions and media, but I think kids are getting too much tech too early in life, and they're learning things that they don't need to learn until later in life. And that's probably the parent in me. I'm sure parents in the 90s said the MTV is horrible. These kids should not be allowed to watch these videos. Or this, they should, how dare they curse on these albums? A censorship label is not sufficient. And now I remember that, but you listen to 21 Savage now, and the stuff that comes out of his mouth is like a million times worse than what NWA was saying in the early 90s. I can promise you that. And so it just keeps getting worse. And so, I'm not talking about censorship, but I am talking about, a more robust filtering system for things that get to kids. And that's probably a parenting issue more than it is anything else. On the AI front, the administration has come out with some AI principles. They should be commended for doing that because it is, you're literally trying to forecast what the future looks like and lay out policy principles for what the future should look like that's going to be created by the private sector as they innovate. You're never going to get it right. So they have to be some basic pillars. And I think that no administration or no Congress should be the sole or final arbiter for what those principles should be and how we should conduct ourselves as a society. But, ideally, they continue to show leadership so that we are having these discussions and forcing these discussions. Because in some other areas, we have not, privacy is a good example. We have no federal privacy standard. We're following Europe and we're following California, and that's not showing leadership. And that's a failure. That's a failure of Congress that's a failure of any Congress and any administration of deciding what, these issues are so vital that we do need to lay out a framework that needs to be complied with.
I'm going to try to combine some of the audience questions together here. One asks about the structure or organization of Congress. Whether there's any reforms that you think need to be made about the structures and organization of Congress to increase the ability of getting things done. And another one that's sort of adjacent to that asks, what can future politicians and policymakers do to challenge the current partisan divide and pursue meaningful legislation? So it's kind of the personal and then also the structural.
Yeah, so I don't think that anything should be done to the structure of Congress. I think it should remain 435 people. I think it should be operated, by leadership determining what gets to the floor. I think committees should retain jurisdiction over the things that they retain jurisdiction over. How it operates on a day-to-day basis, that's not a structural question, but anybody serving in Congress can give you 10 ideas for how they prefer it be operated instead. The funny thing is, the reason that it operates the way that it does is because a majority want it to operate that way. That's the wild thing. You'd never imagine it because you're well, everybody complains, so everybody must want to change. How come it hasn't changed? Well, because they don't admit that they don't want things to change. Members of Congress hide behind their own leadership. And by that, I mean, you will have members co-sponsor a bill and then go to leadership and be like, I co-sponsored that bill. Please don't ever let it get to the floor. I don't want to have to vote for it. Both parties do that. They'll complain about Speaker Boehner or Speaker Pelosi being heavy-handed, and yet they're heavy-handed because their members want them to be that way, or that a committee chair won't get a bill out of committee that needs to get to the floor that a majority of the conference wants to vote for, and so a speaker will grab it and put it on the floor. So like these things happen because members want it to happen. And so structurally, I tend to, and this, I'm an originalist, right? Like if you want to change structurally, if you want to have a convention of the states or a constitutional convention to expand the size of the House, we can do that. But I don't think that more members of Congress means more results or more productivity. I might the argument that it would be the opposite, right? You have more sheep to herd in order to get anything done. The question on how do you get more things done in Congress? So I happen to feel that we're in a moment of time where things have changed so dramatically, and my bias is that I live in the present, right? So we all tend to think like our moment in time is more complicated or more significant than other moments in time. With that as my bias, I happen to feel that our political culture and our systems and our political culture is challenging our systems of government in ways that it hasn't been tested in quite some time. I think the advent of social media and the ability to organize through social media, the ability to fundraise entirely outside of the political party and also leadership process and the conventional way of fundraising, it's all been thrown out the window, right? If I wanted to be in Congress right now, number one, I could have moved to a more conservative district that used to be my district and stayed in Congress, and I could be sitting in an R24 district right now praising Trump. And I could say outrageous stuff on Hannity at night and then have my Hannity bits that would be 2 minutes long put on Twitter, and I could have a national following, and I could raise like $1 million every 2 weeks. I'd be in Congress forever, or close to forever, for a while. And the speaker could come to me and be like, Ryan, you can't say that stuff. That's ignorant. It's whatever. And I'd be like, I don't care. I'm going to do what I want. And I'd go on Hannity the next night, and I'd do it again. And I'd go into, and I'd keep raising that money, and I'd have a national following. And by the way, there are a couple people in the Republican Party and a couple people in the Democratic Party that do that. That's their model. And their model doesn't require them to get anything done. It requires them to be outrageous because being outrageous raises you money. And as long as I vote no on stuff, I'll always be there. Why will I vote no? Because it wasn't good enough, because we need to fight back. Like, that's it, right? It's like that simple. And so our political culture is rewarding folks in the system operating in bad faith. And some of the issues that we're dealing with are so complicated or multifaceted that if you narrow it too much, some will argue, well, that's too narrow, we need to do more. Or if it's too broad, some will say, oh, it's too broad, let's just focus on this one thing. Those things, I think our political culture has not decided like what actually is the solution to this problem. And so you don't have a majority consensus in this country on what should be done, even at the border, right? Or with gun control, as we mentioned. So the things, and again, go back to like read the Federalist Papers. I think it was like 54, like factions, right? Like factions are factions are healthy. It prevents passions from getting things done where the solutions aren't ripe for getting things done. But factions can also destroy you if you don't have the ability to have political parties and your systems bring those factions in and organize them in a way in the system in order to then effectuate a result. And I think we've seen over the past 10 years, again, social media, I think cable television, I think the way that political fundraising happens, I don't think our systems have adapted to that in a way so that, those things kind of get filtered out. Yeah, we got a couple over here and a couple over there, but there's enough in the middle on each side that you can get a majority of one party and like 30% of another to get things done. And then we have the primary process, which, again, back to technology, not blaming technology for this, but it's easier for national ideological organizations to go primary of a candidate who's not sufficiently ideological in districts that are more partisan. So if you're in a Republican 20 district, like you better, and you were around during Trump, like if you said stuff about Trump, you'd be gone. And if you were, and now if it's Biden's a little different, but if you're in a D30 district, be careful, talking about Second Amendment rights, or like, I could think of some other issues, or being against gay marriage or something. Like, you'll be gone, right? You kind of have to line up, with your tribe on a lot of these like hot button issues. And what that does, that has a tendency to like create a lot more uniformity in each of the parties, and it prevents the kind of broader coalitions that you need to get big things done.
And I have to ask as sort of a follow-up. You and I have debated gerrymandering a little bit on Twitter, but do you think that one solution to this is getting rid of political gerrymandering somehow?
So I'm not trying to be cute with you, but I don't know what political gerrymandering is, right? Because somebody has to pick the districts. And so if you're going to do it, technically speaking, if you want to do it based on compactness, that's fine. You could argue something is gerrymandered on the issue of compactness. But outside of compactness, is something gerrymandered because it's an odd shape? Because if you look, a lot of our counties are oddly shaped. Is something not gerrymandered if you have a state that's all like some squares and rectangles? Does that mean nothing was gerrymandered? Not necessarily. Like, depends what your definition of gerrymandered is. Politicians have always, in a certain respect, selected their voters when in every decade. But during that decade, and I think it's a very good example here in Pennsylvania, our districts, we have a more polarized congressional delegation now than we did when I was in Congress and the districts were quote unquote gerrymandered. Why is that? It's because when I was around, we had 4 Philadelphia suburban districts that were all R2 districts that in 2018, even if we were in 2018, would have been tough to hold on to any of those 4, certainly not 4 out of the 4. But now we have, out in suburban Philadelphia, we have an R1, a D8, a D, I don't know what scaling, a D6 and a D12, right? And it's just all, do you push it out this way or do you push it up this way? And then you have Republican districts that are like R24s and R18s. And so sometimes when you gerrymander, in effect, what you create are much more competitive districts. So I am of the opinion, I would actually like to see, and this is, because I'm more center-minded, and if somebody's a Democrat, if they're willing to work with Republicans to get stuff done, I think that's a very good thing. Like, I'm of the opinion that gerrymandering that keeps the partisanship of a district under a certain amount is a good thing. I'm of the opinion that the more R2s that you have and D2s that you have, and the less D20s that you have and the less R18s you have, the better. And if that means you got to create like a little bit goofy shapes to do it, that's fine, because you're forcing people in that district to compromise because the voters in that district are much more purplish. The other thing that I don't like is I have real concerns over independent commissions who draw maps, because I don't think they're accountable to anyone. And if you look at the Princeton project, which the Inquirer thought was like the most objective arbiter in the world of what districts should be, like, there's very serious accusations, I don't even know if it's been resolved, over the person behind that having partisan intent in how they went about scoring districts. So, or we're having a professor from the other side of the country come in and draw a map for Pennsylvanians to determine what congressional districts they're going to be in, rather than a bunch of state reps and state senators going up to Harrisburg and cutting a deal with the governor on what congressional districts would look like. And you can make it sound bad. Oh, it was in a smoke-filled room and politicians are choosing their voters. But like, okay, but at least they were elected to something. And the Constitution says that the legislature shall draw the districts. And, if you want to, if people want to gripe about what the districts look like because something was gerrymandered, well, at least you have somebody to point to that you could hold accountable if you want to. So that's kind of where I come out with it. And by the way, I felt that way long before I was ever elected to Congress or before I was ever, aggrieved or a victim of a redistricting process. I just tend to think that, like, the more stuff that you put in front of elected officials to make decisions on, you tend to get more transparency and accountability out of it than what might sound like a better approach in a textbook.
Fair. How can Republicans have the strong messaging, and I think this is messaging targeted to minority groups, but still continually fail to reach minority, especially female voters? And the second part of the question was on the inroads Republicans are making with some male minority voters. But sort of why are they not making more inroads with female minority voters?
So I think, I think I have two parts of this question. Please hear me out on both. I think one point is historic. And by that, I mean any demographic, if we're going to sort folks by gender and race and say, this cohort has historically voted 90 to 10% for this party, the likelihood is that cohort will continue to vote in some similar measure for whomever they've always voted for. So I think that there's and what happens when that takes place is the party that cohort votes for will tend to make sure that they're doing enough policy-wise and enough constituent relations and enough messaging-wise to keep that 90% cohort voting for them. So that's a piece of it. Having said that, I don't think that Republicans have made a concerted, and also the other thing is, if you look at where the majority of that cohort lives, it is probably in predominantly Democratic districts. And so therefore, it's likely that there wouldn't be occasion for a lot of Republican office holders to go into a community where that cohort has a large majority and speak to them on what they want to do, what they do, or even what their unique problems are. Like, so I'll give you a good example. When I was in Congress, I authored a bill on maternal mortality rates. And I thought it was extremely troubling that African-American women suffered a much higher maternal mortality rate after a pregnancy than a white woman. And I spoke with members of the Congressional Black Caucus on that. Now, I'm in a district I was in a district that was 92% white. I think the African American population was like 4%. I still thought it was extremely a compelling public policy issue to lean in on. And had I stayed in Congress, I would have found ways to go into and speak with Black women. Wouldn't matter to me if they voted for me or not, because I feel it's important, if you're in elected office, to talk to everyone and specifically find ways to go talk to people that don't look like you, right? Not your gender, not your race, not your religion. I mean, I always went to, there was an Indian celebration every year. Like, I just think that that's an important thing to do. And to your point, I think it's important for Republicans to speak in communities that they're not familiar speaking in. I think you learn more as a lawmaker. I also think it's important for your constituents who might look like you, sound like you, have the same shared living experience as you, see you speaking with different communities. Because number one, you realize people aren't all that different. But also there are some really unique things about being a Black woman growing up in this country, or being an immigrant from China who's lived there their whole life, or being an immigrant from Colombia who came here 4 years ago. Like, it's your job to not only learn and be able to understand how different pieces of legislation and different programs impact people differently, but it's also, I think, remarkably effective for people to see if you're a decent person and a caring person and earnest in what you do by letting them see you do that part of your job. And I don't think, and this goes both ways. And I actually think I was very good at I think I was a good politician because I made sure people saw me doing that. But I think that more politicians, if they were to do that, they would get the benefit of the doubt more. And you would also be able to, like, whether it's Black females or name your cohort of, age, gender, ethnicity, whatever it is. The more that you demonstrate access, ability, and open-mindedness, the more people are going to say, thank goodness I have somebody who isn't too set in their ways to like learn and admit that they might be wrong and maybe be for something that they weren't before, or learn how someone's different life experiences not only impact their perspective on things, but also maybe what their needs are or what their concerns are or what the threats are to their daily life and what opportunities they want out of life for their kids or their grandmom or whatever. That's something that I think certainly Republicans, I think, need to do a better job of that in order to change the dynamic or change, frankly, the political failures with Black women, which was your question. But I also think it would make for better policymaking. I also think it would help cleanse our political culture. I really don't like when people carelessly throw around, racism. I mean, racism is a real and deeply concerning and embarrassing component of the history of our country, and it still does exist. But I also feel that the more those terms are thrown around so quickly and carelessly at times, the more that it undermines our ability to actually root out like legitimate instances of it, be they institutional or be they on an individual basis with people. Anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent.
I was gonna close by asking you what gave you hope, because I do want to end on a positive note, but then I got a question that I think can lead you in a positive direction from the audience. What advice do you have for students who hope to enter the world of politics and policymaking?
Oh, that's a good one. As I answer that question and we conclude, I want to thank you for allowing me the opportunity to come speak. I do enjoy doing this. Hopefully it hasn't been too boring for those of you who had to be here or those of you watching. And I loved doing this. One of the things I most enjoyed when I served in office was speaking to people and hearing what they had to say and offering an opinion back, because sometimes, you can be more honest. It's going to sound weird, but as an elected official, you can be more honest with yourself when you have to answer to people. And you have to like get up and like, do you really like, yeah, that sounds good on Twitter, that sounds good on cable television or getting a party endorsement, but do you really believe that? Because you need to go say that same exact thing to everyone else that you represent. What gives me hope? That wasn't your question. Your question was, what would be the advice? So I would say a couple things. First, do your best to hear as many opinions as you can in whatever, wherever you plan on running for office or working in the office of someone who represents people, whether in an elected office or in a regulator's office, because you can never stop learning. And chances are, and I learned this from people who I served with who are very progressive and people who are much more conservative than me, sometimes the reason why people think what they think, or sometimes the perspective that someone has, isn't for the reasons that you think it is. It might be for totally legitimate reasons. It might be on an intellectual basis, an ideological basis, an experience they had in life. And don't feel that you shouldn't be so set in your ways such that you don't feel that your mind could change or that you couldn't learn from people, because you'll become a much better listener and you'll become a much better leader when you open your mind up and your ears up to learn from anyone And that's not people who you might view as equal. That's people who might be higher than you on the corporate totem pole, people that you might be teaching in a class can teach you things. So I think, that's one piece of it. The other thing is you just have to volunteer. Most people, there are people that get elected to office because, they made, a ton of money doing whatever in life, and then they just kind of wrote a check and got elected that way. But for the most part, the way I got ahead or the way I moved up was because I volunteered for everybody else, and I never asked for anything. If someone was running for judge, yeah, let me circulate your petition. If someone was running for township supervisor on the other side of the county, let me go do door knocks with you. If somebody, had a fundraiser, and even when I was like a poor college law student or whatever, like I'd write the $25 check, I'd go to the fundraiser, and I'd always be honest with people. Don't say you're going to do something if you don't do it. Like the real basics in life, in terms of getting ahead in corporate America, getting ahead in wherever you work, on a team that you're on. Like everybody wants a teammate that passes the ball and gets on the floor and scrambles for the loose ball and handshakes the person when they make a good shot and doesn't play victim and doesn't blame someone else when things don't go right and wins the right way but loses the right way too. All those kind of basics also apply to politics. And politics sometimes gets a bad name, and that's because you can't there's not really rules in politics per se. Like you can't get like if you do something wrong, you can't get fired, right? As a political volunteer or something.
Today.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, most people are good people that serve in office and work on campaigns and work in offices. And the good people rise. They rise up. So I would say that would be my advice. Like work hard, be honest, be reliable, be open-minded, listen to other people, and never feel that. Oh, one little final bit of advice, and then I'll wind it up. Luck favors. So like when I was 21, I'm like, I want to be in Congress someday. I'm going to run for this and run for that. And in my head, I'm like, I hope I can do this by the time I'm 30 or 32, whatever it is. Like, you're not like, don't feel that you're on some timeline. Like that is, don't impose upon yourself that you need to be something by a certain point in time. You got to enjoy what you're doing when you're doing it, because when you enjoy things, you're better at them. And when you're better at things and you enjoy things, more people want to be around you. And you show off the best of yourself. And the best way to move up in this world with whatever you want to do is to enjoy doing what you're doing and give your best at what you're doing. It sounds kind of Mr. Roger-esque, but like it's also true. And I think that like had I been disappointed that I didn't meet, some self-imposed benchmarks along the way, I might have done something stupid, like run for something before I was ready to do it, or run against somebody that would have just pissed people off, and then I would have been persona non grata, right? So like, be artful, but and be assertive, but also be willing to be patient. That if you do the right things, like you'll get to where you want to be in politics. So
Thank you.
Yeah,
This
appreciate it.
was really, really, really interesting, and I think illuminating for everybody watching, both in person and on the live stream. So thank you for coming. It was our pleasure to have you, and I hope everyone out there enjoyed this.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. On this nice night, you could have been outside, enjoy the weather.
Good job.